Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Welcome to the Contemporary Writer Series. This is our third event for this year, and we are into our 13th year here at Aquinas, so we're very pleased about that. My name is Linda Nemec Foster. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an alum of Aquinas, and with my husband Tony Foster, we founded the Contemporary Writer Series here at Aquinas, and we're also sponsors for this event. We're really pleased to be able to do that. First of all, I have to ask you to do something very mundane, and that's please turn off all cell phones, pagers, video games, tweeters, whatever you've got, because I've been embarrassed by having my cell phone turned on, and I won't tell you when that happened, but it was too embarrassing to admit. So anyway, thank you so much. And one thing before I introduce Sherod Santos to you, I want to tell you about our next event, and that's going to be our last event for the academic year on April 7th at 8 o'clock, and it won't be here at the Wege Center. It'll be in our theater, the Performance Arts Center. We will be welcoming playwright George Brandt, who will join us on campus for the week. And also the Aquinas Theater Department will be producing his new play, Any Other Name, which is a dark comedy regarding identity theft in Victorian England. So it's had quite a good run in the preview, so we're very happy to have him on campus in April. Before I tell you about Sherod Santos and his many awards and publications, I just want to talk a little bit about the noontime lecture. For some of you who were there this afternoon, in the noontime lecture, Rod really reflected not only his extraordinary mind, but his generous spirit as he shared his insights on poetry and writing and the writing life to the students, faculty, and staff. And it's that same spirit that I was really impressed with when I first saw Rod in action in August of 1982. It's been that long since I've seen him. August of 1982, my first and only time I went to Bread Loaf, a writers' conference in Vermont. And I'll spare you all the details, but let's just say that I sat in on this wonderful poetry workshop, and it wasn't my own. I was studying under William Matthews, but it was another workshop. And at Bread Loaf, you could just go to any workshop if you had free time. So I sat in on the workshop Rod was involved with, and he was so wonderful. And he was really committed to the work of the participants and students and not ego, as some of the other high-powered poets were. So I was really impressed with his generous spirit at that time. And it's also reflected in his poetry and his essays. He has a new book out called The Intricated Soul. It's his new and selected poems, and it was just published a few weeks ago, right, by Norton. He's also the author of 6 other books of poetry, including Accidental Weather, selected for the National Poetry Series, and the Pilot Star Elegies, which won the Theodore Rutke Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Award. His book of literary criticism has also garnered praise, and that's titled A Poetry of Two Minds, and it won the National Book Critics Circle Award in criticism. And I think in one year in 1980, you won the Pushcart Prize for both poetry and essay, correct? I think that was the year. I'll say that. His poetry and essays have also appeared in the Paris Review, the New Yorker, the Nation, Poetry, the Yale Review, Kenyon Review, Antioch Review, name any major literary publication, and Rod's been in it. He also has won quite a number of awards for his work, not only the book awards I've mentioned, but also NEA fellowships and a Guggenheim. He recently retired as a Curator's Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Missouri and currently lives in Chicago. So please help me give a warm welcome to Sherod Santos.
Thank you, Linda, and Tony, both of you, for being the one. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. How's that? Can you still know? Better? Okay. I just wanted to thank Linda and Tony for the force behind, one of many forces behind the series, and Pam Lubke in the back, who's been extraordinarily patient and with my many finicky and constantly changing needs and so on. I'm going to be reading from, as Linda said, the new and selected, and I'm going to throw in some newer poems as well. I'm going to avoid the chronology and all of that, so there's going to be something mildly fractured about the reading. I'll be jumping between kinds of poems and periods in which the poems were written. And I'm going to begin with a somewhat eccentric poem called Catalogue Raisonné, which is normally refers to a descriptive catalog of works of art, but this poem is really about the artist, or I should say about artists themselves, artists of all sorts who seem to me a species of deeply afflicted and obsessive and neurotic and wonderful and bedeviled and inspired and group of people, and I hope I reflect something of that in the poem. These are, some of them are, they're miniature, some of them are no more than a line or two. Catalogue Raisonné. A pianist who masters a Chopin etude by practicing it in her dreams. A landscape painter so proud of his work that his paintings take months to dry. Because his genius had at heart a deep-seated need to be loved, he gave up writing early in his life, moved to a cabin in Maine, and devoted himself to carpentry. A poet who often leaves the house with his shoes untied, not from forgetfulness, but from inspiration. An actor who, before going on stage, can't look at anything round. A dancer who dances with such lightness of spirit that while leaving the theater, members of the audience seem to stagger beneath the weight of their bodies. A writer who stops writing about her life because, as she says, I don't believe anything I say about myself. A successful morning of work, and for the rest of the day, a desire to tidy up the apartment. An avant-garde artist who's deeply offended by a critic who, in a review of his work, described him as a positivist. A poet who passes the afternoon underlining all the interesting passages that appeared in his earlier work. A soprano for whom a particular note is as remote as an island that can only be reached by air. A novelist who sleeps, wakes, makes her bed and goes for a walk, but when she comes home, the page is still blank. Excuse me for making so much noise up here. I've got everything sliding around. The next four poems I think of as snapshots of a sort. They're not connected to each other in any way other than the fact that they seem to carry their own set of sympathetic features. They're short. The first one is called In the Hospice Gardens. A scene I actually, when sitting with my grandmother in California, saw through a window and has stayed with me ever since. In the hospice gardens, midday in the bright sun, a woman of 30 or 35, too weak, exhausted or disinclined to walk the few yards back to her room, raises her pale blue hospital gown and in one slow motion squats along the pathway to pee. and standing there beside her, her hopelessly embarrassed father, unable to look, unable not to look. Goodbye. A girl sits on a carousel camel in a shopping mall on a Sunday afternoon. Her mother watches from the fountain. The carousel starts with a jolt. The girl startles. The mother startles. The camel rises and begins to move, trot, break into stride. And when it comes full circle, the girl lets go of the metal pole, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her mother back there, still holding the warm coins in her hand. My girlfriend Mags, it's M-A-G-S, Mags, my girlfriend Mags. Her marigold raincoat hung from a hook at the back of the door. The turned up, humid heat as though someone had already breathed the air. 13 or 14, she looked to be mad. Margaret, the nurses called her, each one a parent in quiet shoes. The scooped hollows of her collarbone, the braid of dark hair. She let me see her childish breasts beneath the hospital gown. They made me want to cry until I touched one and she said, "They're getting there." On the limits of poetry, there's a reference at the end of the poem to a famous passage in the Iliad when Achilles, in an act of almost psychopathic cruelty, ropes the slain body of Hector to his chariot and drags him around the walls of Troy. And while Achilles is a kind of indigenous part of our culture now, and while figures like that sort of dominate the collective conscious of our literary minds, there are more familiar people. There are more everyday people, people we pass on the streets ourselves as well, who seem somehow beyond the reach of poetry. Not to say that poetry doesn't speak about and to the everyday person, but simply that there are particular emotions that are inhabited by us that seem uncontainable or inexpressible by poetry. Anyway, that overburdens the poem far too much. On the limits of poetry. As the sun goes down, she is cutting up the dried out Christmas tree and tying the bundles with twine. Earlier in the day, she'd rearranged the furniture and after breakfast refilled the plastic storage bags with strings of lights and garlands, the keepsake bells and ornaments she'd accumulated over time. She is 40, living alone in a bungalow with a broad front porch, and, for the most part, she keeps to herself. No telling what the poets would make of her. Though they might be surprised to discover how perfectly happy she is. For 3,000 years, Hector is butchered on the battlefield, dragged by the heels past the Scaean gates, and yet her happiness is somehow unthinkable. The next poem is now you were going to flag me when the time comes, so I'm going to try to keep track, but you'll help me. It's called Film Noir. It's a poem, obviously, that borrows a kind of cinematic style, I guess you could say. A mist had settled over everything. It was after 10, almost 11. A smudgy lamplight overran the curbs where leaves had started to gather as well. Some young people prowling the neighborhood were afraid that nothing would happen tonight, just as nothing had happened the night before. Although it was cold, the boys wore cut-off sweatshirts, and the girls more comfortably dressed for the weather, kept laughing at the things the boys said. A car turned onto Millbrook Road, dimmed, and then extinguished its lights before rolling to a stop in the leaves. When the young people passed, they banged on the hood with their fists, the boys, not the girls, though the girls were amused by this as well and frightened the man inside. Or did they? The car door opened, the man stepped out and, as killers do in Hollywood films, slipped a hand inside his coat. And then, in a quiet, almost whisper of a voice, he said something none of them could hear, though how he said it seemed the thing he said. Without looking back, the young people kept on walking, though faster now, kicking up leaves as they went. And when they were finally far enough away, they were sure the man couldn't hear. One boy turned and shouted back, "Oh yeah, we're really scared." And that was that. One of the girls drew closer to the boy who said those words. Another drew farther away. Now, as I said, I'm going to be varying the poems in tone and form and content as well, I guess you could say. And the next poem is a slightly longer one. It's a monologue. It's called The Talking Cure, which is, as you know, a phrase, a practice, one might even say a belief the 20th century inherited from Freud. And it's an odd belief, to be sure, at least it is in my mind, because it's based on the assumption that talking in and of itself can actually heal various disorders of the mind. So, in other words, the more you talk, the more you heal. At the beginning of the poem, the speaker is addressing what appears to be a psychoanalyst of some sort. Not appears to be, but is addressing a psychoanalyst of some sort. He's an adult, and he's speaking about an event in his childhood. It appears at the beginning that he's emerging from hypnosis, or perhaps simply from the deeper recesses of memory. The Talking Cure. Eyes shut, lapsed time, the 2 a.m. aquarium light, the background noise of my parents' party winding up downstairs, nothing more than the usual things, laughter, commotion, voices lowered, voices raised, voices calling across the room, and music too, as I think back, though I heard it only as a thumping sound, like something in the walls, like a heart or something thumping in the walls. Was that perhaps what awakened me? All I can say is I found myself suspended within that blue-green glow the aquarium cast in the darkness of my room. A ghosted room, as it turns out, for a woman's softly whispered voice breathed out beside my bed. "Shh, shh," the voice said. "It's only me," though I couldn't imagine who me might be. And before I was able to ask her, she passed a finger across my lips and held it there. And when she took it away, she pressed her mouth on mine. She lifted my head, she kissed my eyes, she kissed my face and neck, and then in one slow, continuous motion, she unfastened a pearl snap button on her blouse and guided my hand inside. How do I feel about that? Do you mean, what do I think about how I felt? The truth is, I have no idea what I thought, or even if I thought at all, for it seemed somehow unreal to me. What happened then, what happened when she eased my hand from the cumulus of that warm and rounded fullness to a place I could only conceive of as a vacancy, a chill alongside where it had been. She drew it, you see, along the raised abrasion of a surgical scar that cut in a transverse angle from her rib cage to her shoulder. And that, she told me, was the reason she'd come, the reason she'd left the party downstairs, the reason she simply wanted me to look at her, wanted me to look and see the body her husband refused to see. But could that really have happened? I wondered about it even then, and how could it possibly end in tears? The tears that all too readily came when she finally stepped back from my side, let fall her blouse and underthings, and stood there lighted by a sorrow pitched well beyond the reach of my 13 years. And this is where I ask myself if all of this was only a fantasy, just another freak-enciphered scene that rises to the surface of an adolescent dream. Believing that, my parents both earnestly stood their ground the following fall when her husband found her 4 months pregnant, sprawled out naked on the bathroom floor beside an empty bottle of Nembutal. Of course, I talked to people about it when things came to light. One caseworker in particular took the better part of an afternoon to explain why whatever this woman did, whatever had passed between us since, had nothing to do with love at all, not with real love anyway, but with something more, how did he put it? Unnatural, I think, though clearly he meant to say perverse. I accepted that. I saw the sense. But what I recall, and admittedly it took me years to sort what's fact from fiction, what I recall is that as she stood there, figured, in that watery glow her ever-receding memory casts, I swam out to her to be taken up by the current of her inclining arms, to be folded back into another world where my own tears start, though what I wept for, I can't say. That is what I remember. That and the more unlikely fact that all of this happened even as she was somehow muffling the sounds I could not keep down, easing me under and taking me in, lowering me into the mind's all suddenly silvered light, and inside that to a welling in the blood, a fullness in the heart, the secret solitary nowhere of a place where in one brief fluorescing rush, a shudder of grief and arousal struck a lifelong inwrought echoing chord. I can tell by the way you peer up over your glasses that you're probably wondering why, in 35 years of marriage, I never told my wife about any of this. But let me ask you something. Now that our session has come to an end, now that I've chattered on and on while you, as usual, say nothing, let me ask if you and the others in your profession don't sometimes feel like the ones to whom it has devolved from God, no less, to serve as custodians for our souls, ones who keep from raveling into oblivion that elaborate tapestry of self-delusions upon which our community now depends for moral and spiritual guidance. No, I didn't think you'd answer that. You're right not to, of course. And so, the reason I haven't told my wife, it's simple, really. I just didn't want to hurt her. I know you'll say my not telling her might hurt her more, but it seems to me, despite that conventional wisdom, some truths can do more harm than good. Or maybe I've only come to feel as time has passed that we understand less than we pretend about how to love, or why we should, or what we ought to expect from it. And who's to say, given the passionless affections, the pent-up malice and forbearance with which most couples tend to treat each other for the better part of their married lives, who's to say that what I had with that poor woman years ago wasn't actually love of a finer kind than I've known since, or am ever likely to know again. I think I will. I suppose the poem about genocide would be inappropriate now because I realize I'm skipping over 3 poems and found that one awaiting me. So let's do something else here. This poem is called Pilsen, which is a section of town in the south side of Chicago. And I suppose the poem is about, if poems are about anything, clothing. Though I hope it conveys something of the abrupt and sometimes disturbing feeling that people are who they appear to be, and that we are here not to see them, but to behold them as they pass before our eyes. Pilsen. In the empty soccer field bleachers, 2 day laborers listen to a radio in flame-resistant chambray shirts. A Ph.D. tactical uniform passes in a van. Beneath a leafless tree, a boy in a cashmere shawl and his far less political girlfriend in unisex denim scrubs. Cyclists in Visgard vests, skull-capped hawkers, a beautiful Puerto Rican woman pushing a stroller in camouflage pants, and foraging trash cans looking for food, the same old man with the Fouquet helmet tied at the chin. Not a single beret, unusual for this time of year, but a cloche, a fez, a Mardi Gras horn hat, its yellow, green, and indigo spikes tipped with bells whose tinny chimes pass unheard by the woman weeping, wearing her grief on a rusted wrought iron bench. I'm having kind of a hard time reading my watch. Does it look like 15 minutes, 10, 15? 10 or 15? Okay. This is another poem that shows the influence of a film style, cinema verite, maybe documentary style, horror movie. I'm not quite sure which of those. Having slept in a turnout in the back seat of her car, she awoke before dawn, shivering, hungover, unsure of where she was. To her surprise, the sodium lights on the billboard she had parked beneath were no longer on. Wind gusts, the smell of rain, the raw, unbroken landscape like a field of ice. If this had been a movie, someone would have been sitting up front, someone who held her fate in his hands. Though she couldn't see them, she could hear birds passing overhead. Why do they even bother to cross so vast and empty a space? At the moment, none of the usual explanations made sense. Her head ached, her feet were cold, she couldn't find the words, and the man up front, what did he think? What would he do? Must something still happen before the end? And as I say, I think I will, joking aside, there was a poem called The Monument, which is a poem about 20th century, well, what do you think, darling? Do we have... are you up to another? Okay, the poem is, I'll just give it a shot. The poem is called the monument. And I suppose if we constructed a monument to anything in the 20th century, it was to our almost industrial capacity for genocide. In fact, the term didn't even exist until after the Second World War. It was what Churchill called a crime without a name. And there's this amazing young engineering student in Lvov in Poland who took it upon himself, realizing that one can be prosecuted for killing a person, but one can't be prosecuted for killing 1 million people, and took it on as his life's work to come up with a legal set of particulars for doing just that. Anyway, the cast of characters in the poem is made up of figures familiar to all of us, with the possible exception of Tamerlane, who is the 14th century Islamic conqueror whose notoriously bloodthirsty campaigns ranged across much of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and who once ordered his troops to construct a wall of the slain bodies of soldiers and civilians in a city they'd just sacked. With a couple of minor exceptions, all the details in the poem are remarkably enough accurate. And the poem's a double villanelle, which you'll hear what it is. It's a poem in which there's a great deal of repetition, which seemed historically appropriate to a poem about the recurrence of these crimes. From the legions they raised against him, Tamerlane built his fabled wall of blood and bone. But in order to cast its shadow over the warrior kings to come, he killed those left behind as well. In 1915, the Young Turks, counting heads, conceived an epic-making joke. How many Armenians does it take to build a wall 10 times that which Tamerlane built from the body parts of men? But the answer was monumental. The answer was something heretofore unimaginable. On such grand scale, the answer, they knew, was modern. Eventually, they'd have to kill them all. And so, decades later, having counted up the Jews, Hitler begins to brood, for who, he asks his cabinet, remembers the Armenians anymore? And even if they did not exist, even if they had never existed, the gypsies and homosexuals, the Freemasons, JWs, dabblers in art, when added to that already numberless sum, might easily make a shadow of Tamerlane's wall of blood and bone. So next he figures the Christians in, and those who might be faint of heart, the listless, the stutterers, the bookish and halt. And he figures how, with the help of a roach poison, Zyklon B, he might actually kill them all. And so the wall continued to rise, and so the wall, as if framed and lighted in a photo by Leni Riefenstahl, overrode its lagging history, even though history did not exist, even though it has never existed. In the Soviet Union, the bourgeoisie is Lenin's self-appointed task, so when Stalin takes over, the job's been done with greater skill than Tamerlane dreamed could raise a wall from blood and bone. Nevertheless, Stalin will go on tracking them down in the parks and cafes, among sporting groups and writers' guilds, factory heads and party leaders. He will go on killing them too. He will go on killing them all until the wall makes a relic of the Führer's dream, for it's a wall composed, just imagine it, from the corpus of one's own citizens, even though citizens did not exist, even though they had never existed. So when Mao makes war on the landlords and intellectuals, the pacifists and sly imperialist spies, when even where they do not exist, he mortars them into his own great wall of severed limbs, he conceives of it as possible. So unnumbering are his kind to refigure a wall that's all on earth still visible from the moon. If only he can go on killing them, if only he can kill them all. And ever higher it grows, well beyond the reach of thought itself, until sheltered in the jungle one afternoon, a man named Pol Pot speculates how, even if they do not exist, even if they have never existed, he could eliminate all who ever wore glasses, or brewed sweet tea, or whistled a tune. The zeros spiraling off his pen like the cries of the dead, the ohs that no one, not even God, can hear. For as Tamerlane in his Providence knew, the wall is the wall of oblivion. And even if it did not exist, even if it had never existed, we'd have had to kill them anyway. We'd have had to kill them all. Okay, well, I am going to finish up with a couple of poems that introduce a milder and I think more loving note. The next is 3 parts, very short parts. And actually, when I was writing it, I thought it was a rather mournful poem, though when I showed it to my wife, she said she thought it was actually hilarious. And so I think the 2 varying perspectives simply affirm my impression that when we're in love, we are, both sublime and ridiculous, or sublimely ridiculous, or ridiculously sublime, all at the same time, and sometimes it's impossible to tell which is which. It's called "Only So Much Light Can Be Cast on a Single Subject." We argued, we fought, we walked out on each other in the morning and walked back in the afternoon. After an early evening nap, we tried to make nothing of it. She stood outside, scraping moss off the window ledge. I chopped wild fennel and garlic shoots for a bucket of sea snails soaking in brine. A loosening rainfall just before dusk in the gravel courtyard bordered by grass at a bed and breakfast near Portland, Maine. And on the stone seat of a planter trough, the sheltered lean-to our bent backs made as we huddled, talking, trying to recover whatever it was we'd imagined we'd lost. If only for the sake of conversation, we decided after dinner to talk about the past. The heart makes its own assumptions, she said, as if quoting a line from a poem. The wind turned one last legendary page and blew the votive candles out. Stars came after, and silence cheeped like a tiny bird. And since I began with a kind of catalog poem, I thought it might be appropriate to end with one as well. It's called, "Was It Like That Then?" How often these days, struggling to recall some incident or other, I'm struck by the feeling of sifting through ash and the adult fantasy tinged with fear that who I am is composed of what, perhaps only what, I can never reclaim from the rubble. Then, as well, there are certain moments that advance in time and turn the fantasy over. A young married couple from out of town struggling together because they just can't give up holding hands to open the heavy cathedral doors. A woman who, to keep from crying, steps into a shop selling artificial limbs. Somewhere in the mysterious turnings of sleep, her asking her father for a glass of milk. The smell of salt grass off of Half Moon Bay. In the middle of the night, the light from my bedroom shining in the garden. My mother in a sundress on the first day of spring, though it's raining heavily and cold outside. The shared emotion of a radio song. The momentary happiness in a stranger's voice. A bouquet of flowers. Alyssum, Sweet William, tea roses, fern, left behind on the concrete rail of a sailing pond Luxembourg Gardens, Paris, 1984. Thank you all very much for coming out.
Mr. Santos will entertain any questions, and if any students need to leave for study groups, now would be a good time. We'll take a couple of minutes here, but please stay if you have any questions about Rod Santos' work and his writing process. So just give him a few seconds here. Okay. And also, he will be very happy to sign any books, later on.
I don't know how able I am to answer them, but seriously, I will do my best. Yes, ma'am. That poem has a very odd history. It took me, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years to write. I was actually doing research on this young man that I mentioned to you, who I stumbled on by accident. And I'm ashamed to say his name has just slipped out of my head, but he was a young engineering student in Lvov in Poland. And this happened. It was a friend of his who had been part of a mass murder. And he couldn't figure out why there was no mechanism for prosecuting, why there was no legal structure for bringing to justice people who had killed massive numbers of people. So this kid, when this all started, he was 22, 23 years old. He transferred from engineering, immediately went into law school, joined a law firm, which, would have been one of those that is sort of active in the reformation of legal procedures and that sort of thing. And he established a particular unit within the company that was there specifically to both study the history of genocide and secondarily to see what was required to create the mechanism for prosecuting them. And as I say, this didn't occur until after the Second World War, and he was working just prior to before the breakout of the war. So, it's an amazing figure, just to think about. Well, now we have international law. We've also seen how, at times, impotent the international body is to enact those laws and to prosecute them. But, there are war trials going on right now, and there have been in a variety of cases, and then there are others, as in Rwanda, for example, where they have been sort of set aside or given a lower priority. And you probably saw Milosevic today saying that, his the genocide that took place there was a myth, that was, something that people invented and didn't really occur. So, but the Nuremberg Trials were the first legitimate, official, international, prosecutorial structure for bringing to justice people who were a part of mass murder, or as we now have the name, genocide. But you can imagine, Churchill saying this is a crime for which there is no name, which means this is a crime for which there is no structure for prosecuting it. But in order to prosecute across national boundaries, you have to have an international body. And so anyway, to go back to your question, I had discovered this kid, and his story was so compelling to me that I began researching about him, and this led me to say, okay, he's thinking backwards in time in terms of the 20th century, essentially. And so to go back to one of the, mass murderers go back to the beginning of history, human history. But Tamerlane was somebody who seemed to make such a display of it, the idea of composing a wall. And he was someone who wanted to establish himself as the superior warrior king for his time, and to set an example that would be unsurpassed in history. This was his way of essentially making his name historically, was to kill on such a mass scale. And this was another one of the people, it had been done again, but one of the things that was remarkable about people like Tamerlane is that they were set not only on killing the legions and warriors and soldiers they fought against, but then, having killed them, killing all the civilians as well. So it was essentially to erase the body of people that had opposed him. And then to create these kinds of monuments. That's where the title kind of comes from, is that these things were not only monumental, but in his case was creating a physical monument. So anyway, after a year and a half of piecing it together, and it was this form that, as you could hear, repeats various things over and over again. And it was originally a single villanelle, and then I realized the 20th century scope of this could not fit into one, so it became two, a double villanelle, and I suppose it could be, there are sort of no limits on the size the poem could take. But I was only interested in kind of capturing the 20th century because there has seemed to be almost a race to surpass. I mean, is this actually factually true that Hitler went to his cabinet and said, nobody remembers the Armenians, and that was a mass genocide as well, and had occurred in 1915. So if nobody remembered it 30 years earlier, what do I have to do to make people remember? So then you say, well, I've got to up the scale. And then, when Stalin came in, the scale, again, you have this madman tyrant who wants to surpass his predecessor. And then Mao was the same way in China. So, we all know the story. But Tamerlane seemed a kind of totemic figure to me. And I ran into him via this young man who, shame on me for forgetting his name all of a sudden. But yes, ma'am.
What do you think it does to throw out, to try to imitate in a way the monument, talking about the same poem, by structuring it in this formal way and kind of building a wall with yourself, echoing the rhyme of the wall, when thinking about talking
I'm sorry, I missed the last thing you said.
thinking about the talking here
Right.
in the other poem too.
Right.
And then I get to this. What does the poem do repeating the history? How do you look at that poem, the genocide poem?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
In terms of what that does for you personally, to repeat and reflect what happened, or what that does for us as a society to repeat and to repeat patterns.
Right. Well, I guess, first of all, we have to distinguish between which pattern is being repeated. And so I don't know what it does for me personally. The poem sort of began at fragments and notes and research, and I guess the villanelle seemed the appropriate form, although I can't actually say I ever even realized it was going to be a villanelle, and maybe, obviously there was a stage at which I didn't even know it was going to be a poem. But as I said in the introduction, I think I said, the poem's repetitions seemed to reflect the kind of hysterical repetition that the century itself has enacted. So the sound, I thought, I hope, is forgetting about the substance of it, the kind of obsessive, neurotic, obsessive repetitiveness of it. I hope grows to a kind of maniacal level. And that seemed to me to be true historically, to thinking about it in terms of genocide, to a pattern that has repeated itself in similar ways historically regarding the issue of genocide. So, there's countless acts of genocide that didn't surpass the preceding record, as it were, that are not included in the poem because I wanted this to be a wall that's growing. And so that was the thing that I was after. And when you have the second sound, which is the sound of these other ones that just couldn't quite reach that monumental level. I mean, monuments are in some ways meant to supplant something else. They establish themselves as, that's what monument means, I suppose, is something that stands higher than the sort of real basic structures of communal societal life. They stand out, I guess. So my sense was that the villanelle, and it just came from, these are echoes. The thing about, well, I should have to kill them all. This is not a phrase that's a piece of poetry. This is a phrase that I have run across, I don't know, a dozen times in researching this poem, spoken by political, military, religious figures about a particular group of people that said, if we want to get rid of this, we're going to have to kill them all. I mean, that's not an imaginative invention on my part. And as I said, there are only maybe 2 details in the whole poem that are not historically accurate. And there's very little invention on my part, except to the degree that a poem is it's an artifice. And so, it's a creative, it's an aesthetic structure. But the actual language and details are merely fitted into this poetic structure. But the language is the language of history. And that's the amazing thing about it, is that it just goes on being said and being done. I mean, there is no point at which it seems to have been curbed. There's no point at which it seems to have receded, in a tidal kind of way. So the fact that it's being reenacted over and over and over again with an accelerated, just simply because we now have what I call the industrial capacity for mass murder. That it was much harder in Tamerlane's day because they had to be killed, one by one. The potential, we have the capacity now for eliminating enormous groups of people essentially sitting at home, So our ability to kill massive numbers of people is so much more sophisticated that in some ways that makes it all the more perilous and all the more possible that this monument will continue to grow. And certainly there's no evidence to the contrary yet, so far as I've been able to discern in any case. Does that get at what you were asking about? Yes. Yeah. I should probably be saying I was inspired by these ideas, but poems have largely been, finding ideas to fit the words and rhythms and images, rather than the other way around with me. There are certain poems that have been sort of self-generating. Certainly the Monument is one of those, and there you've kind of been caught by a fever more than an inspiration, maybe. The 2 cinema pieces, it began to appear to be film noir to me as soon as the guy got out and put his hand in his shirt. And I realized, oh yeah, this is the classic film noir scene when a guy gets out and reaches. And then I realized, there's a way of highlighting particular things that preceded and follow that to draw out that particular feature. But I certainly didn't begin by saying I think I'll write a film noir poem, but discovering a likeness that I liked and wanted to amplify. And the other one, as I say, I was a little less clear about which genre of film I was working with, so it still has a question mark at the top. So. Yes, sir.
Speaking on your poem, The Talking Cure,
Yes.
you talked about how we have this ridiculous notion that talking actually may solve our problems, and to those ends, the speaker in the poem seems to be talking but not talking to his therapist. So in terms of the poem in particular, can you comment on audience?
Yeah, well, I did. I was being sort of glib about, the idea of the talking cure. It's clearly what we've learned about brain chemistry in the last 15 or 20 years, and Tony, you're better able to talk about this than I am, has made enormous advances in dealing with mental illnesses of all sorts. Far exceeding the advances that were made by 100 years of the talking cure. That said, I'm a firm believer that there are two things which are necessary to the recovery process. Let's just call one therapy, and the other whatever chemical imbalances are in the brain to be rectified and reordered. And this, what they have discovered are that there are these deficiencies, depletions of particular chemicals in the brain that can lead to depression and anxiety and various other things. So that said, for all of my glibness, and I apologize for that, about the talking cure, but it was in some ways a kind of orthodoxy that this was the only way to deal with mental illnesses. And so I just wanted to preface my answer to your question, and now I've kind of forgotten what your audience, yeah. And by that, do you mean the psychotherapist, the psychoanalyst that he's talking to, or the audience that I'm speaking to?
Oh, in terms of the speaker, his ability to rectify what has happened to the therapist.
Yeah, well, the therapist, and rightly so, should treat this as a crisis. And the idea of hysterical repetition, again, a kind of originally a Freudian idea that there are things in childhood that go on repeating themselves, and they will continue to do that, and they do this in a way that is detrimental to the mental health and physical health of various individuals who suffer from them. There are crises that have to be unraveled, I guess is the way of putting it. And if they're not, they just go on repeating themselves. So this notion of hysterical repetition has its basis in that things will keep happening unless you can somehow get them out. You work your way to this core and you begin to unravel the knot, which, has certainly demonstrated itself as effective in countless examples. Now, in the case of the poem, the speaker is clearly skeptical about, first of all, is the psychotherapist even listening? Because the psychotherapist, in his case, never talks back. So you get to the end of the session, you say, okay, well, I've talked for another hour. We've come to the end. You've said nothing in return, virtually nothing in return. And so you have been my audience. And, this is not unlike many experiences people have had with psychoanalysts, is that you come out saying, I really talked, I wept, I got to, to this particular crisis in my life. And then you say, and what were you told? And, well, that's not the role of the psychoanalyst to say this is how you then solve the problem, as it were. It's to take you to the problem, to let you lead yourself to the problem. And that's done by various directives, questions, and so on. And then when you get there, you might be, recommended to see a psychologist. You may be recommended to see, go into various programs that deal with whatever your particular crisis happens to be. So in the poem, the guy doesn't have much faith and gets angrier and angrier as the poem goes on, and then gets to the point to say, what do you psychoanalysts for a period in time, what is the pretense here that you have now developed the ability that in earlier centuries would have been the provenance of religious figures, the sort of wise people within various religions who give you advice, counsel on whatever happened to be the disturbing elements within your life, and so you turn to religion. And in some ways, I'm way out of my league here. I'm going to shut up. I realize, where am I going, and what do I pretend to know about this subject? I take all of that back. I don't know anything about this, but the figure in the poem is very angry, and is angry because he truly believes that he was in love. And even though, the people he met with, the counselors who said this wasn't love, it was a kind of perversion, and, there are lots of, and it seems to be ever more public now, of stories about older people who have had affairs with younger people. And, you have people like, is it Mary Jo Letourneau, the woman who, there are countless examples of it. And, it struck me that with some people, its societal perspective on all of this is that it is a form of perversion. It's criminal, and, it's essentially a violation. And I think that's probably what it is. In the case of this particular figure's life, it was something very different. And I think it's different. I keep running into these dead ends. And it's where my mind says, you don't know what you're talking about now. What you know is what he said. What I know is what he said in the poem. And that far from wanting to be healed, he's been married for 35 years. He's obviously in a barren marriage. And he looks around him and sees, all of these loveless marriages in the world. And yet the one he had with this woman was both mysterious, powerful, passionate, and ended tragically. So the way in which that has carried over into what is now a sort of sedentary, domesticated, routine, and probably slightly vindictive relationship with somebody else seems, in memory, a lesser thing. So in other words, this was the love of his life, to use that corny phrase. And I won't project it into a discussion about is this good or bad, or criminal or not criminal, just that in the case of this one individual, it seemed very interesting to me and possible to me that it could be perceived as in the face of this marriage of his own that seems to have faltered, could be viewed as something that was, like I say, a love that distinguished itself from all other loves he has seen and felt himself. Is that okay? Well, I'm sure I'm wearing you all out, so. One more?
I have a question about the role of poet and literary critic, which you both do so well. When did you start writing literary criticism? How far
I don't think I ever wrote, I mean, I still don't think of myself as writing literary criticism. All of the pieces that are in that book were given as lectures, some in Belfast, where I taught for 9 years, in the summers for 9 years at a school called the Poets House, and each year I would give a lecture, and it was to young people who, for one reason or another, political or economic, didn't have access to higher education. So these were people who were poets, but were essentially, given circumstances in Belfast, not able to get together with other writers and talk about the thing that they loved. And so they considered it great privilege. It was all, they were all given free access to the school. And so every year, you know, there's a gathering of 15 or so poets who would come in. And so the talk was really not so much literary criticism as it was a way of amplifying, you know, one particular subject which we all shared, which was poetry, but one particular part of it. One is called Poetry and Attention, another, you know, they all have. So I don't think of them as literary criticism in the generic way in which that is mostly used. So almost all of them were lectures, you know, some in little towns in Louisiana, some to students I had in Missouri, most of them to kids in Belfast. And so, you know, I did it because I knew the summer was coming around. I wanted to write something that would, you know, be thought through for them, you know. All right. Thanks so much for spending so much time. It's very generous of you, and for coming out on such a lovely night.